I will make all of the introductions at the beginning. Jesse Jenkins is a faculty member in MAE here and in the Andlinger Center, and he leads the Princeton Zero Lab, which focuses on improving and applying optimization-based energy systems models to evaluate low carbon energy technologies and to generate insights in order to guide policy and planning decisions. Ilissa Ocko is senior climate specialist at EDF, and she employs climate models to explore how short-lived climate pollutants such as methane and black carbon influence various climate conditions. She also works to improve the metrics that compare climate impacts of various mitigation strategies. Jessika Trancik is professor at the Institute for Data Systems and Society at MIT. Her research examines the dynamic costs, the performance, and the environmental impacts of energy systems in order to inform climate policy and accelerate beneficial and equitable technology innovation. And Gunnar Luderer, who's deputy head of the research department at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and professor of global energy systems analysis at the Technical University of Berlin. He leads the energy systems group at PIC and is the lead scientist for the Remind Integrated Energy Economy Climate Model. He also serves as deputy chair of the research department on transformation pathways. All of these speakers today have remarkable other accomplishments, for example, involvement in IPCC efforts, but I'm going to let you read the bios of that. With one exception, we're going to hold all the questions to the end. Jesse Jenkins has rearranged the schedule so he could join us this morning, but he must leave at 10:30, so we will take one or two questions immediately after his presentation. Please put your questions in the chat. I'm going to do the best I can to keep all speakers to the schedule. I'll give you a 2-minute warning. Let me turn things over now to Jesse to kick off this session.
Thanks, Simon, and hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Happy to kick things off this morning. Talk a bit about the transition to net zero emissions, which is the critical goal, the point where contributions to greenhouse gas emissions by human activities are exactly equal or balanced out by any removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, also due to human activities. That's not the end of the challenge, but it's the point where we no longer keep digging a deeper hole, where we stop contributing to atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases that are rising and will continue to cause climate change until we stabilize those emissions. Of course, that won't be the end of climate change. There's a significant amount of inertia in our climate system and a significant amount of climate damages that are on their way already and around us visible today. So we need to be simultaneously prepared to adapt to those challenges even as we transition to net zero emissions. But this goal has become on the tip of the tongue for most of the world's nations and policymakers, and numerous major corporations and sub-state actors who have all recently committed to net zero emissions goals. And that's, I think, thanks to the fact that sustained policy support across multiple countries over the last several decades has driven dramatic cost declines for some of the key technologies we need to reach this goal. That includes wind power, solar power, and batteries, which are the critical cost component in electric vehicles, as well as now our fastest growing source of energy storage for the power grid. These technologies and others have transformed the economics and therefore the political economy of deep decarbonization or net zero emissions goals. And I think are largely the reason why we're seeing such a widespread set of commitments to goals that perhaps a decade ago would have seemed impossible or economically prohibitive, but now seem quite viable. In fact, Princeton's Net Zero America study, which was released at the end of 2020 and updated in a final report in October 2021, as well as other recent detailed analyses, present multiple pathways that could get us to net zero emissions by 2050 across the entire US economy, and that depend only on technologies that are at relatively high degree of commercial readiness. That is, technologies that have been demonstrated at a pilot stage or later. So we're not dependent on breakthroughs for commercial fusion or other lab developments that could certainly help expand our toolkit, but are not necessary at this stage to reach net zero. Energy expenditures, in fact, as a share of GDP, are below recent decades in all of the pathways that we model in the Net Zero America study. That means this isn't some kind of World War II style mobilization required where we have to invest 20 or 30% of our economic activity in this energy transition. In fact, the incremental costs relative to a no new policy scenario effort are modest, less than 3% increase in the net present value of expenditures on energy through 2030, and perhaps even as little as zero, depending on the impact on oil and gas prices. That's also on par with the substantial public health savings that we're likely to, that we will accrue due to reduced pollution from transitioning away from fossil fuels in our energy consumption. So while affordable, this transition to net zero emissions is transformative as well. It's going to require overcoming three key challenges that go beyond the economic cost to transforming how we make and use energy, how we build, how our workforce looks to build our energy system, and to mobilize the capital required. So the first challenge is rapid and sustained deployment of physical infrastructure throughout our energy system at a pace that we really haven't seen before, or at least not in generations. For example, by 2050, the Net Zero America study means that pathways mean that we would have to roughly triple US electric transmission capacity over the next 3 decades. It took us roughly 150 years to build out our current grid. And so what that means is we have to build the same amount of transfer capacity twice over 15-year periods in the next passage through the time through 2050. We'd also have to build between 1.5 and 3 terawatts of new wind and solar power. We have only about 1.3 terawatts of total generating capacity in the United States today. On the demand side, we need a rapid transition to electric vehicles and heat pumps for transportation and heating, which is going to require some significant changes in our distribution networks, in our homes, and our buildings. We have to construct a new national CO2 transport and storage network to enable us to capture, use, and store CO2 from a variety of sources, including biomass used to produce hydrogen or liquid fuels that can capture the CO2, store it for negative emissions, or use it for carbon neutral production of synthetic fuels. We also need the emergence of an entirely new clean hydrogen and bioenergy supply chain, industries that are really not present at all today, but would play critical roles in our energy system in 2050. The next challenge is one of capital mobilization. While affordable on an annual energy expenditure basis, transitioning to net zero emissions energy systems requires a significant increase in capital investments due to the capital intensive nature of clean and efficient energy technologies. Basically, we're swapping capital, steel on the ground, copper, more efficient devices for fuel consumption. And that means that our upfront costs go up, but our annual expenditures go down. And we'll finance and pay back those investments over time, resulting in affordable annual energy costs, but requiring, according to the Net Zero America study, the need to mobilize on the order of $2.5 trillion in additional capital investment this decade alone, and about $10 trillion by 2050 relative to a frozen policy scenario. The third challenge is the workforce transition. We can't transform the energy system without transforming the energy workforce in America. All of our scenarios lead to net job increases in the energy supply related sectors, as employment in growth sectors, mainly wind, solar PV, and grid related jobs, substantially outpace declines in fossil energy related employment. However, this overall positive employment story masks significant regional and sectoral dislocations that need to be proactively managed for both normative reasons and practical or pragmatic political economy reasons. This starts with a decline in coal-related employment in the 2020s, relatively small at a national scale given the scale of employment, but localized impacts in Wyoming and Appalachia will be significant and need to be managed for local communities. This extends to larger declines in the oil and gas-related employment, which can hit certain regions harder. The political durability of a net zero transition is likely to hinge on how well we manage this challenge. In conclusion, 2050 might seem like a long way off, but in the time frame of infrastructure investments, planning, or innovation, 2050 is really the day after tomorrow. And that means that the 2020s are the pivotal decade if we wish to get to net zero emissions by 2050. We need policy conditions that support sustained and rapid capital mobilization and deployment of mature clean energy technologies at scale. That primarily means wind, solar PV, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and energy efficiency improvements in buildings and industry, all of which are ready for large-scale deployment this decade and can cut emissions substantially and affordably over the next 10 years. We also need proactive investments to spur early deployment, improvement, and cost declines for less mature technologies needed in the 2030s and 2040s. That includes hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, clean, firm power generation, and a variety of other technologies. We also need policy that proactively manages workforce transition challenges and transforms the siting and permitting processes to simultaneously ensure stakeholder buy-in and more rapid permitting and construction. It's a big challenge to do both of those things at the same time. Without key policies like this in the next year or two, I think we'll almost certainly fall behind the timeline we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and a 50% reduction in emissions below our peak levels by the end of the decade, as pledged by the Biden administration and the US nationally determined contributions. This is the pivotal decade, and time is not, we don't have much time to waste. So we need the policy environment to evolve to support the significant deployment of clean energy technologies and to proactively manage the three transformative changes that I described in this talk. Thanks. Happy to take a few questions now before I have to depart, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you.
Thanks very much, Jesse. Especially thanks for staying on schedule. Let me just get the questioning kicked off for you, which is you laid out a very comprehensive view of what America has to do to get to net zero. How does this? How do these goals translate to the global level and getting other nations on board?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, there's two aspects of this, right? One is that, the United States has been a major, the major contributor to cumulative greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we have I think arguably a moral responsibility to take leadership and responsibility over our own emissions reductions. And we have the technological means and the wealth to do so. And I think that's actually probably the more important part. There's some degree of, we have to do our part to inspire others on the global stage. But I think the more impactful effect of U.S. leadership is that our investments in the range of technologies needed to confront climate change in the U.S. And to decarbonize our economy can drive cost reductions and improvements and mature supply chains for these technologies that then spill over to the rest of the world. And in fact, it goes the other way as well. So the U.S. is currently enjoying the fact that solar PV is in many places the cheapest form of new electricity we can get. And that's thanks in large part to investments made in the US early on, in Japan, in China, and in Germany to support the development of these technologies when they were expensive alternative energy sources. And now we've driven them down in cost to make them mainstream, affordable, scalable technologies. And so the US can contribute substantially to that same effort for continued cost declines in wind, solar, and EVs and other things, but also for technologies like clean hydrogen, for carbon capture in industry like cement or iron and steel, for direct reduction of iron to be able to produce steel from electricity or hydrogen. So a variety of different technologies we would need to develop and improve over the next decade and repeat the same kind of success that we saw with wind and solar and lithium-ion batteries. And that can have a huge impact on the world, making it easier for everyone to transition to net zero emissions.
Thank you very much. There is a question or part of a question that Leonard Miller has asked in the chat, but it's incomplete. Pete, can you is there a way to enable Leonard to ask his question? Because he asked, would you agree there are two other challenges? But
I don't know which ones they are.
But
there are many other challenges,
but the two other challenges are not listed in Leonard's question. Yep. So Leonard, I think you've been empowered now. Can you ask your question? Well, perhaps not. Okay, he asked, do we need to modify intellectual property rights in this area to ensure that innovation is available around the globe?
So I'm not so sure about that. I think early on in the global climate talks, there was a lot of discussion about technology transfer, this idea of sort of giving IP and technological know-how to the rest of the world. I think that can play a role, and there's certain things, vaccines are a good example of that, where we have a public good nature of the technology where it makes sense to help facilitate IP transfer. And there may be certain examples here as well. But I think it's more just the global economy will manage the transfer of technologies that are more cost effective, that are able to scale and help meet the demands for growing energy in the developing world. If we can make those technologies cheap and affordable and scalable, then they'll be the technology of choice for much of the world. And that doesn't necessarily have to involve technology transfer or IP transfer, but it has to involve global trade and innovation and cost decline, support for early deployment of these technologies, where the US and other wealthy countries bear that upfront cost of driving them down driving these technologies down in price. And so it's that sort of investment in the learning curves, the experience curves that drive technologies down in cost that I think is the biggest role that the wealthy world can play, and paying that higher upfront cost, as we did with wind and solar and in electric vehicles and batteries. We can do the same thing for a variety of technologies.
Thank you. That question actually came from Leonard Nakamura. Following up on that, and then we'll move on to Ilissa. Jesse, there may also be issues of cooperation among companies and whether there are antitrust limitations that might prevent that.
True. And also, international, there's been a discussion about forming international clubs that focus on innovation in particular technology areas where countries have technological capability or resource bases that make sense. So a subset of countries could collaborate on improving carbon capture or improving hydrogen production or improving off-grid distributed generation of microgrids. So there's a variety of those technologies that countries have a common interest in, and their economies have, and technological capabilities would suit them to working together on that, and that I think is a productive area for international collaboration.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Leonard Miller, your question is just not appearing in the chat, and we do need to move on. If we can get that fixed, we can come back to the question at the end, but Jesse won't be here. Thanks very much, Jesse, for your presentation. And let me turn now to Ilissa Ocko, whom I introduced before. Ilissa, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. So first, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this really important conference. As Simon said, I am a climate scientist at the environmental advocacy organization Environmental Defense Fund, but I'm also the mom of a toddler, so I perhaps spend too much time reading rhyming books, hence my quirky but hopefully memorable presentation title, that when we think about achieving net zero goals, we need to focus on the past and not forget about the math. So let's dive in. So we are here and we want to be here. And the two key points I want to make today are that first, the path we take in terms of emissions reductions over time to get to net zero is equally as important as when we reach net zero. And second, how we combine all greenhouse gases into a total amount of emissions can make a big difference in terms of the actions we take and the resulting climate outcomes. So first, when we talk about the path mattering, one of the key reasons is because it determines our success in achieving temperature targets. So for example, consider two illustrative but reasonably realistic cases to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 2050. The only difference between these two paths are when we begin reducing CO2 emissions. All other greenhouse gas emissions are equal. Because the overall warming depends on how much overall CO2 we emit because of how long it lasts in the atmosphere, what matters is how much CO2 we emit before the net zero goal. So while net zero is an important milestone, it isn't the sole indicator of achieving our climate goals, as illustrated by the resulting temperature responses to these two pathways, where you can see that one path has a much more desirable climate outcome than the other, with one even overshooting 2 degrees Celsius. So the second reason the path matters is because it determines the climate outcome over all timescales. It's important to keep in mind that net zero emissions is designed to achieve long-term climate stability, and it doesn't address what happens in the coming decades. So if we now adjust our illustrative pathways to include early reductions in methane that are achievable with existing technologies, we get even more desirable climate outcomes, and especially in the near term and around mid-century. This is because methane is a short-lived greenhouse gas. So the moment we stop replenishing the atmosphere with methane, which right now is responsible for at least a quarter of today's warming, we can almost immediately have an impact on temperatures. So the bottom line here is that we can have numerous different paths that all achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions in 2050, but each results in a different climate outcome, some more and some less favorable. And so for a similar reason, we can also technically never achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions this century and still achieve our climate goals. So the net zero by 2050 goal is a useful milestone, but again, not a guarantee of climate success nor an indication of failure. And so you can learn more about this in a paper my research team published recently in Scientific Reports. So to recap here, what's at stake if we don't consider the path? Well, we could overshoot temperature targets, we could have suboptimal climate outcomes in the near term, and you know, those are not desirable outcomes. And so what are some of the solutions to avoid those having those outcomes? So first, being mindful of the carbon dioxide budget, which is really what determines what the ultimate temperature rise will be. Acting early, doing everything we know we can do right now as soon as we can, and not waiting for technologies to develop, is really crucial in terms of constraining your budget and emitting as little CO2 as possible. Also, preserving carbon stocks is really important. If you imagine an existing forest and how much carbon is stored there, if we were to create a new forest from scratch, it would take around 100 years to store the same amount of carbon. So it's much more efficient to preserve our existing carbon stocks than to, you know, do deforestation and then try to rebuild forests in other places. We also need to slash short-lived climate pollutant emissions rates. This also, the earlier we act, so we know there's a lot we can do right now, the earlier we act, the better the climate outcomes will be in the near term. And finally, if we have separate interim targets for long and short-lived climate pollutants, it will help us get on good paths for both types of pollutants. And I'll go into this a little bit more in the math part of this. And it will also, you know, help us act early too, to have these interim targets that aren't all the way out in 2050. All right, so now switching to the math, which plays an important role in the path. The first reason the math matters is because combining all greenhouse gases for one target requires a metric, which is essentially math. So this is because the definition of net zero greenhouse gas emissions is the sum of all the greenhouse gases we add to the atmosphere and how they must equal how much we can remove. And so, but each greenhouse gas affects the climate differently. So adding them up is actually not simple at all. And we need to somehow combine three important factors that indicate each gas's importance. So the first factor is how potent these emissions are at trapping heat. The second factor is how much of these pollutants we emit. And the third factor is how long these pollutants last in the atmosphere, which means how long will they actually be trapping heat for. And so this third one is really crucial, but it makes the math tricky. So we often separate the gases into two baskets: the short-lived climate pollutants that last for years to decades in the atmosphere, and they don't build up that much over time because they are efficiently removed from the atmosphere. And then we have the long-lived climate pollutants that last for centuries to millennia, so they do build up over time, committing us to warming for generations to come. It is these pollutants why net zero is needed, because we can't just reduce their emissions. Every time we emit more, we can cause more warming. For example, around 40% of the CO2 emitted in World War I is still in the atmosphere right now, causing warming. So this is in direct contrast to the short-lived climate pollutants that can cause a lot of warming in the near term, but don't commit us to that much warming in the long term. We don't need net zero emissions for the short-lived climate pollutants, which is why we can technically never achieve net zero total greenhouse gas emissions and still achieve temperature targets. So the second issue with the math is that the standard metric that has been adopted and used for decades and is used for net zero calculations and has proven resistant to replacement by improved methods overlooks the role of short-lived gases in near-term warming. So this metric is called global warming potential. It combines these three factors that I just mentioned to convert non-CO2 gas emissions into their CO2 equivalents. And the problem is that it computes the climate impact of these gases over the following 100 years from just a pulse of emissions. So for the short-lived species that only impact the climate for a short period, we are including decades of time in the calculation where they are not influencing the climate. So the result is that the true impact of these pollutants from when they are actually in the atmosphere is completely overlooked. So a quick example of why this is important is when we consider our climate action priorities by evaluating the roles of each sector in contributing to warming. So when we use a simple climate model to quantify the
2 minutes, okay?
Great, perfect, thanks. When we use a simple climate model to quantify the role of each sector over the next 30 years in contributing to additional warming in 2050, in the absence of further climate action, the methane-dominated sectors, which means the majority of greenhouse gas emissions emitted from that sector are methane, account for around half of the warming, and the two largest shares are for methane-dominated sectors. But when we use the standard GWP 100 metric that is used to calculate net zero greenhouse gas emissions to do the same analysis, we get a much different picture. The perception of the importance of the methane dominated sectors is cut in half. And now the two largest shares are from the CO2 dominated sectors. So what's at stake here with the math is missed opportunities to reduce warming in the near term, potentially more warming in the near term if we aren't careful, and our climate action priorities may not align with our goals. So some solutions include using metrics that convey climate impacts over all time scales, using climate models when possible instead of these simplified metrics, and never relying exclusively on GWP 100. So just to wrap up very quickly, the path matters because it determines climate over the coming decades in 2050 and whether we achieve temperature targets. The math matters because it can hide or reveal the distinct benefits from reducing both short and long-lived pollutants. And thankfully, there is a win-win strategy. If we do set two separate interim targets for emissions reductions of both short and long-lived climate pollutants, then we can really help ourselves get on the best path and address both types of pollutants adequately. Thank you all so much for your time, and I look forward to the Q&A part of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilissa. And again, thanks for keeping right on schedule. So as I said, we're going to save all the questions now for the end. And so let's move on to Jessika, who will be the third speaker.
Okay, great. Thanks, Simon. All right. Hi, everyone. My comments will focus on technology and how to be more deliberate about advancing technology needed to reach net zero emissions. As many of you may know, technology is essential to decarbonizing energy systems and mitigating other sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And one question that comes up is whether we already have all of the technology we need to reach net zero emissions. And if so, then why are emissions not already falling faster or falling worldwide? Well, the truth is more mixed. We have some of the important technologies we need to support decarbonization, but we still need to further advance technological tools and importantly, accelerate the adoption of the tools that we have in order to reach net zero emissions within 3 decades. So let me review where we are now and what is left to do. Where are we now? We're in a different place from where we were just 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. In that we have a few key technologies that have seen major improvements in both cost and performance. I'm showing 3 examples here, which are really the standout examples. Those are solar energy, wind energy, and lithium-ion batteries. Solar energy costs fell by more than 99% over 4 decades. And as we documented last year, lithium-ion battery costs have fallen at comparable rates by 97% over 3 decades. Wind costs have also fallen. So those are really the standouts. And these technologies costs fell through a combination of government policies around the world, growth and investment in the private sector, and technology research and development efforts. Now, these 3 technologies alone can make a big difference because they offer a foundation to build decarbonization efforts on. So that's really why, you know, the conversation that we're having now, this panel is, you know, on this topic whereas even just 10 years ago, we didn't have as much confidence, but these technological tools that we have now give us some confidence. We can use them to decarbonize a big portion of electricity cost effectively. We can do that with solar and wind energy, and we can also electrify and decarbonize a good portion of vehicles used for ground transportation. And we can also electrify other energy services such as heating and some industrial processes. And with all of this, it's possible to support a substantial amount of decarbonization. But there remain challenges and the need for additional technological tools to reach a net zero emissions economy, including the challenges in fully decarbonizing electricity. So that's one of the pieces of the pie shown here, with variable solar and wind energy plus storage and possibly other supplemental generation, decarbonizing all transportation, including long-haul heavy-duty transportation and industrial processes, including those that require high temperature. And of course, there's still a need to tackle non-energy service related emissions. Moreover, even for the currently easier to decarbonize energy services, which are the other pieces of the pie here that are not highlighted, technological advancement such as better batteries and less expensive and more reliable wind power will help accelerate the transformation. And importantly, to bend emissions down, these technological tools need to be adopted at a faster rate, which itself requires technological advancements to integrate these new technologies and, as was just talked about, to clean up and phase out the older technologies. So some of the technological advancements that are on my short list that we still need to focus on include low emissions but energy dense fuels, technologies to deal with solar and wind variability, including long duration energy storage, demand management, and transmission expansion, carbon-free non-variable generation, some amount of post-combustion carbon cleanup, leak prediction, detection and prevention of methane emissions. Also on this list are approaches to reduce inefficiencies and cost overruns in the construction and management of energy systems. So that means reducing what are called soft costs, which can really go a long way to enabling a faster transition from older to newer technologies. We also need other technological advancements in the form of predictive models and software, and likely technology involving both humans and machine intelligence to allow better integration across energy services. So there's more work to do. And if our deadline for net zero is mid-century or around then, we have less than 3 decades left. The advancement of these technological tools and the acceleration of their adoption has to be more comprehensive and faster than what we've seen before in those 3 key tools that I started out talking about. So how can we speed up progress? Well, we always have limited time and limited money. We have limited time. If our target is in 3 decades, there's always limited financial resources. So we really need to increase the success rate of each dollar invested and each unit of time invested. And one way to increase that success rate is to be more deliberate about technology through greater and better anticipation of how our invested time and money will advance technology. And this is the focus of my research. And I want to give you a couple of examples of how we do this by developing models and insights that aim to help us understand the process of technological advancement and what can lead to success or failure. Another key approach is to estimate targets that collective innovation processes can work toward for technological components over which we have agency that can add up to and create beneficial system-wide change. So really the goal of all of this work is to develop usable insight at the level at which decision makers have agency, including policymakers, private investors, and engineers. So let me give you just a couple of quick examples and then I'll wrap up my comments. I want to talk about some work we did on solar energy and really understanding the process of technological change that technology went through in order to hopefully learn some things about how we could recreate these successes in the future. Now, solar energy, the cost fell dramatically. It's often held up as a gold standard for policy influence clean energy innovation. But do we know what drove the success? It can be tempting to, come up with stories about that it was all about policies in China or economies of scale, but can we really pin down what the real drivers were and estimate quantitatively how much these different factors matter, in order to hopefully be able to recreate successes like this in the future. So to do this, we developed a model of innovation, in this case, cost change. And the approach is to develop a conceptual model and a quantitative model of the process of cost innovation and its drivers at these three nested levels. At the level of the device physics and the manufacturing process, the low-level mechanisms, the level of company strategy and emergent phenomena like economies of scale, and at the level of policies. What we found was that solar modules cost decline was driven by more than 5 different low-level mechanisms that each contributed more than 10% to the total cost decline. So one of the reasons solar energy's cost may have fallen so much was that there were these many different knobs to turn that helped explain the steady progress and rapid progress over a sustained period of time. In terms of,
2 minutes, okay?
Yep. Thank you. In terms of high-level mechanisms, public and private research and development was important. You can see there, and economies of scale were important as well, but not the largest driver. At the level of policy, we estimate that 60% of the cost decline was driven by a diversity of policies that incentivize market growth, while about 30% came from government support for research and development. Now, importantly, the types of improvements that we saw at the low level were quite different based on these 2 different policy instruments. And one of the lessons we can take going forward is that many technologies will require probably a different mix of these 2 types of policy instruments: market creation, which really jumpstarts efforts in the private sector, and government investment in research and development. And through these kinds of models, we can understand and anticipate what mix might be most successful. Of course, there's always uncertainty, but the idea here is to increase success rates while working with that uncertainty. Now, not every technology has followed the trajectory of solar energy, and it's important to consider those cases as well. For US nuclear power plants, for example, they've experienced a cost trend in the opposite direction. Costs have increased. When we look at this using a similar methodology, we can identify the reasons for this. One of the main reasons are soft cost overruns. I'm concerned about this for a number of other projects going forward. Some of these projects that are required to integrate many technologies into an overall integrated decarbonized energy system. And so it's really important to keep an eye on these soft costs, and we can use these types of mechanistic models like the one I developed that I presented for solar energy. And we also developed a similar model here for nuclear that I don't have time to go into in detail. Now, let me talk just a little bit about that second approach I mentioned about estimating targets for technologies. We can do this not just for individual technologies, but also for infrastructure. So we looked at this in the case of electric vehicle charging, thinking about where to place chargers, what power they should have in order to allow for rapid and equitable electric vehicle adoption. And we found that really charging locations are not all created alike. We can't haphazardly, if we want to achieve this rapid rollout, we can't really haphazardly site these charging stations and sort of haphazardly choose the technological specs, but we can be more deliberate by really understanding behaviors, energy consuming behaviors, and use that understanding to inform our investments. So to conclude, what I hope I've conveyed is that I do believe that we have a great foundation, those 3 technologies I started talking about, solar energy, wind energy, and electric lithium ion batteries, that offer a great foundation on which we can build decarbonization efforts. But of course, to meet mid-century net zero targets, the adoption of those technological tools and the advancement of others is going to be important, has to be accelerated. Progress needs to be more comprehensive, economy-wide, and faster in the coming decades. One way to accelerate progress is to be more deliberate about our investments of time and money in technological advancement as policymakers, investors, and engineers. Models can help us do this by anticipating approaches that accelerate the process of technological improvement and adoption. And there's always going to be uncertainty about the future, but that doesn't mean this has to be entirely guesswork. We can use models. We've seen this in vaccine development, for example. We can use models to allow us to be more deliberate in our investments of time and money in key technologies to address this important societal challenge. Thank you very much, and I will turn over to the next panelist.
Thank you very much, Jessika. And Gunnar, it's over to you now.
Yes, I'll share my screen. I hope you can see my slides okay. Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot to the organizers for this great conference and for having me. It's great to have this opportunity to discuss pathways towards reaching net zero targets. So let me start with this graph about residual fossil CO2 emissions, which is inspired by the idea that really one of the key merits of switching to a net zero logic is that it kind of changes the discourse away from talking about incremental emission reductions in various sectors towards really trying to understand how we can squeeze out those last bits of carbon to really become carbon neutral in the economy. So it's quite instructive to break down emissions from various sectors, both on the energy side, there's energy supply side here in orange, most importantly electricity, but then also demand side in terms of residual fossil CO2 emissions that emerge from those sectors. And what we see is that in all kinds of scenarios, and this is just like one illustrative scenario towards reach 1.5 degrees target, there is a number of key elements that in some combination really form the central pillars of these decarbonization strategies. And these are, first of all, of course, energy efficiency improvement, but then a quite rapid decarbonization of electricity supply, which goes very, very soon, accompanied by an increasing electrification of energy demands, and then eventually more and more decarbonization also of residual fossil fuel demands, or residual fuel demands, for example, by using biomass, synthetic e-fuels, most importantly, maybe also hydrogen. And then what's also important is that these remaining fossil CO2 emissions then need to be offset via carbon dioxide removal. And this is actually one area where we see quite a big difference across different scenarios in terms of how much the relative weight between carbon dioxide removal on the one hand side and actual reduction of residual fossil CO2 emissions, how that plays out. Going a bit deeper into this question of electric versus non-electric energy, one aspect that's very robust across different scenarios, and what we look here is a number of scenarios that we produced ourselves, but then also compared to scenarios compiled by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenario database. And what we see there is that if we look at the carbon emissions per unit of energy consumed, that there's a substantial difference between electricity and other combustible fuels in terms of how fast this reduction of fossil CO2 emissions can be accomplished. For electricity, we see this reduction of 80 to 90% by 2030 in all these scenarios that are compatible with the Paris targets, whereas for non-electric combustible fuels, this goes quite a bit slower. So we still have substantial remaining fossil components in most of those scenarios still by mid-century. And this has very important implications for the overall economics of energy prices. We all grew up in a world where electricity, here shown in red, was a pretty expensive energy carrier. But to the extent that we need to regulate carbon-intensive energy carriers, such as solids, coal, oil, and gas, those energy carriers will get more and more expensive, for example, by introducing a price on carbon. On the other hand, for electricity, because we can switch more and more towards renewable electricity sources, we can decouple the price of electric energy provision from those the carbon regulation, and that means that in the long term we expect across all scenarios that electricity will become relatively a lot cheaper than other energy carriers, and that's a fundamental shift in the basic economics of energy systems. So complementary to this question of what are the remaining fossil CO2 emissions, we can also look at the system again in the same illustrative scenario in terms of what the remaining carbon fuel demands are. And what we see in terms of final energy demand is that quite robustly across different scenarios that the role of electricity will increase here in the orange colors. But the big question is, how far can we go in terms of electrifying demands? It's very important to understand that currently only 20% of global final energy demands are in the form of electricity. 80% of those demands are in the form of non-electric fuels. And in this particular scenario that we looked at here, we really pushed the limit of how quickly you can ramp up electrification. And we still see that there is a number of carbon-based fuels that remain. Most importantly, liquid hydrocarbon fuels required for transportation. So this is, but also like some additional hydrocarbon fuel demands, for example, for industry. So ultimately, these carbon-based fuel demands, they are the main bottlenecks towards reaching net zero emissions, and that's why it's very important to take a closer look at what these bottlenecks are like. A big question now is, does net zero also imply transitioning to zero fossils? And that was also a discussion that came up in yesterday's panel. And what you see is not necessarily all net zero pathways also have like a complete fossil phase out, but what we see also is that this question of a fossil phase out gets increasingly relevant. One example of that is Germany's climate neutrality strategy. So in Germany, we have now the official government target to reach climate neutrality by 2045. At the same time, we have quite limited sustainable bioenergy resources, and also carbon capture and storage is very limited. So if we look at scenarios towards reaching this 2045 climate neutrality target, what gets evident here in this very simplified illustration, that not only for power supply, we reach pretty much 100% renewables, but that also for this non-electric component of final energy here in the blue shades, we need to switch completely to renewable energy carriers because we are limited in our negative emissions and CCS potentials. Of course, this question of moving to a complete fossil phase out very much hinges on the question if we have alternative non-fossil combustible fuels. And the big question now, or like the entire debate now moves towards the question to what extent we can rely on hydrogen and hydrogen-based electric fuels to fill that gap. In discussing this question of net zero strategies, it's very important to keep in mind that we are actually working in a very dynamic technology environment. And I think that nicely was shown by Jessica's talk, who already emphasized that we really see this very rapid technological change in solar and wind power. Also, cheap batteries play a key role for limiting the amount of fuels that we need in the road transport sector. So we really have a lot of opportunities there. But it's also important that this is not equal across different technologies. It's also something that Jessica has emphasized. For nuclear, actually, we see development in the other direction, that things even get more expensive over time. Also, we see quite sluggish development of CCS, which makes our previous estimates that we have done with integrated assessment models about the role of CCS, a bit outdated also. And then finally, with regards to the role of bioenergy, there are very substantial sustainability concerns, like different studies point to that. Let me just point out here to this question of land demands for bioenergy. So what we see is we need between 10 and 100, like 2 orders of magnitude more land surface per unit of energy provided with biomass compared to other renewable energy sources. And this is very substantial. Let me jump over this slide and then come over to a summary that I would form in the present in the form of questions for the discussion. I think it's very important to keep in mind that there's different innovation potentials of different technologies, and the big question is there a built-in advantage for like small granular technologies such as wind, solar electrification, like battery electrification, electrolyzers, compared to like more lumpy technologies such as nuclear and CCS. Another big question is, what are the limits to rates of upscaling? So we really have to move very quickly, and reaching net zero within a few decades really is mostly a challenge of rapidly ramping up those new technologies. Another big question is how much biomass can be supplied sustainably? That's a key determinant of the question to what extent we need renewables-based power fuels. And then if we focus on the electricity sector, there's one philosophy to entirely focus on supply side solutions to providing a backup generation to renewable electricity. The other big question is to what extent can we flexibilize demand, for example, from hydrogen electrolyzers, for example, from electrified heating grids, or from integrating electric vehicles into the grid, which also could
two minutes now.
Okay, I'm about to finish anyway. So, and the last point I would say is to understand what suitable policy instruments are. So we really have to move, like not only understand what suitable pathways towards reaching net zero are, but then to also understand what policy instruments bring about those changes, especially in those sectors that are harder to decarbonize, like transport, international transport, aviation, shipping, but then also very importantly, the material industries. With that, I would like to stop sharing, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion.
Very good. So thank you very much. Thanks to all of the speakers for really great presentations. I will try to summarize questions that are put in the Q&A. So please, if you have questions, put them in there. And I would interpret the first pair of questions could be for anybody, but I'm going to ask Ilissa to take a first stab at them, which is, to what extent should we be using public funds in order to encourage innovations and to reduce the impact on the consumers initially until we really get things underway? How should government funds, for example, be used to encourage switches to less intensive, carbon intensive technologies?
I think I'm going to kick that to the other panelists because I really don't focus on the economic side of things at all. So I apologize. Not my area.
Jessika or Gunnar, either one of you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, sure. So Simon, the question is, can you repeat it?
Well, I'm summarizing. I can read you the question, but basically it's to what degree, what role should public funds play in encouraging non-fossil fuel related innovations and protecting the consumer from the impact in the short run, at least, so that there isn't strong resistance to them.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess what I would say is my answer is kind of in two parts. Wherever possible, what we see really from looking inside the process of the technologies that have improved and, those that haven't improved as much, and where I'm talking about improvement in terms of not just the performance of the devices or the power plants, but also their adoption. But what we see is that, wherever possible, if public funds can be used to incentivize a private sector response, competition among firms, that is really the most effective way to, use those funds. Now, oftentimes, however, depending on the level of development of the technology or the infrastructure, it's also important to have allocate public funds toward direct investment in research and development, and sometimes direct investment in demonstration and deployment. But really, kind of, if we look at the innovation efforts that have occurred, to the extent that a bit of public funds can be used to nudge markets forward, you can sometimes stimulate a very large response from the private sector. And then in other more difficult areas where it's harder to create that incentive, then there is a need for more direct investment by government. And then just the final thing I'll say, the second part of my answer is that really we have not done a good job thus far in thinking about kind of the equity angle and who is benefiting from public funds invested in technology improvement. And that is a critical aspect of policy that really needs to be focused on, even when we're talking about the development of technologies in the R&D phase, but certainly when we're looking at policies that stimulate deployment, that create incentives that have thus far mostly benefited wealthier individuals, and moreover, in places where there is a tax on pollution, a carbon tax, then there are sort of disproportionate effects, negative effects on less wealthy individuals. So that's another really, that second dimension is really important as well.
Very good. Not necessary, but Gunnar, is this an issue you want to weigh in on?
Just a quick remark on this. So from a European perspective, the carbon market really is the central policy instrument that we have. And I think I would argue for very good reasons. And yes, it's true that the primary effect of the carbon market is that you have a disproportionately high impact on poor households because they have a higher share of energy expenditure in their household income. At the same time, it's very important to recognize that carbon pricing gives you new governmental revenue. And the way the debate is going now is that we can use those funds that we get from carbon markets and redistribute them on a per capita basis in a way that renders the overall effect progressive. So such that poor households have a more beneficial net effect than richer households have, because on absolute terms, the carbon footprint of richer households tends to be substantially higher.
Thank you. So Ilissa, I do want to come back to you for this question, which is, you talked about the various metrics and emphasized the fact that there were long-term and short-term effects. Depending on the timescales we're talking about, that implies to me perhaps the need to introduce some discounting factor. Does that make its way into the metrics somehow in terms of the long-term versus the short-term?
Yeah, sometimes it does. There have been dozens of metrics that have been introduced to deal with this challenge of putting all sorts of climate pollutants on the same scale. And some of them take an approach of looking at integrated radiative forcing over time, and some of them look at a temperature impact at a certain time, and then some of them go farther and use discount factors or whatnot. But the bottom line is that there really is no perfect metric that exists, and even introducing a discount factor into it still can be a value judgment, and it still can depend on what discount rate you use, for the same reason that a time horizon is a value judgment. So I've seen no evidence to me that suggests that that's the right way to do this as opposed to other methods. But regardless of that, what we've seen by the user community of these metrics is that they're really resistant to change. And so having people move away from global warming potential has been incredibly difficult. So it's almost like we need to work with what we've got. And so we put out a paper a few years ago that suggests that you use a 2-value GWP. So you still are using the familiar GWP concept. You still use the 100-year that people are used to, but you also use a 20-year GWP that can also convey climate impacts in the near term. So you have both numbers. 2 numbers is, can be, people are resistant to that as well, but there are a lot of other metrics we use in our day-to-day lives that are 2 metrics. We have high and low temperatures, we have SAT scores that are verbal and math, we have gas and gas mileage that's city and highway, we have our blood pressure with systolic and diastolic. So, so there are ways to do it, but overall, anytime we introduce a value judgment into it, it will change our perception of what it actually means.
Thank you. So here's a question for Gunnar. If affluent countries were to limit their cumulative emissions to an equal per capita share of the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius, how does that affect which mechanisms they can and cannot rely upon to deliver on that? And how do you evaluate the role of reduction in demand for energy and materials services in those countries? Are you considering scenarios with reduced aggregate consumption?
Yeah, first of all, especially if you consider the 1.5 degree target, the overall budget is so small globally that if you were to break it down per capita, which seems reasonable from an equity perspective, but it's so tight that, for example, in the case of Germany, we would need to become carbon neutral not by 2045, but by 2035 or even earlier. For the US, it would be even higher because current per capita CO2 emissions are even higher in the US. So you really hit, I would say, the limits of what you would have to go beyond the limits of what you can, of the transformation rates that you can achieve in an economy without really going to an absolute crisis mode. And that's a challenge because it requires a good framing of this equity question. A question could be, for example, could financial transfers or technology development, could that be used to make up for the inability of industrialized countries to live with a kind of fair per capita share of the carbon market? So that's it's a very tricky question, but I would say for Europe, it's an extraordinary challenge to already reach those targets that we have, climate neutrality by 2045. In the case of Germany, 2050, in the case of Europe, it would be extremely difficult to kind of limit that or compress it more to live with this fair budget. The other part of the question regarding consumption, there is already a lot of demand changes in those scenarios. You can, of course, argue to what extent further reducing things like travel demand, the amount of kilometers that everyone travels, or the amount of steel that we need in the economy, the amount of cement can be reduced. That, of course, would create a bit of a buffer, but these demand changes tend to be a relatively slow variable. There's a lot of inertia in social behaviors. So I personally am quite pessimistic to what extent that can help us to fundamentally change these challenges in moving towards climate neutrality.
Thank you. Leonard Miller asked the following question. I'm not sure to which panelist it's directed, so I'm going to ask Jessika to take a first swing if she's willing. He asked, would you agree that all that has to be accomplished over the next 28 years is going to be unrealistic if the current spider web of permitting restrictions on large capital projects is not addressed? Shouldn't this be a top priority?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I would broaden my answer to include many inefficiencies in, permitting and kind of interconnection costs in the case of, for example, solar energy. There are many soft cost categories that are not seeing the cost declines that we see in hardware costs. And my concern is that going forward, if we are to use the technological tools that we have for electrifying many energy services and decarbonizing electricity, and then building off of that, with additional fuels, for example, potentially for long haul transport and so forth, that the soft cost category is going to become larger and larger unless we really start to be more deliberate about those soft costs. And that's something that we're working on, is really modeling these processes as a technology themselves. So we have to be thinking not just about hardware when we talk about technology, but about all of these processes that lead to soft costs and inefficiencies, and also resistance to change in the transition to decarbonized energy system and sort of net zero emissions economy wide.
Thank you. The next question from Wilson Irvin is directed at Ilissa, and she's prepared to answer it. EDF has done great work to highlight the importance of methane and to spur discussion. How are we doing in terms of action? Do you think methane emissions will fall in the next few years? Ilissa.
Sure. Thanks for the question. There are two reasons why I'm hopeful. So the first is policy, and the second is technology. So in terms of the policy, we've gone from over in the past year, methane not being on the radar and just at all in terms of commitments. It was just lumped together with other greenhouse gases in terms of total greenhouse gas targets. We went from that to it becoming almost like a methane moment last year, where it was highlighted in media outlets, and it was talked about on political stages, and that culminated in the global methane pledge just a few months ago at the COP meeting, where more than 100 countries agreed to reduce methane emissions by 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. So that was really exciting to see that kind of momentum in reducing methane. So of course, countries need to fulfill and follow up on that, but that's really exciting, and that hadn't happened before for methane. Secondly, in terms of technology, there are two key technologies that will be available soon that will really help drive down emissions. So for the two largest emitting methane sectors. So the first is from agriculture. The majority of emissions come from livestock. From when cows digest plants like grass, they produce methane. And there's new cutting edge technologies that are feed supplements that can suppress methane emissions in a methane production in a cow's gut. So that's really exciting. It's far along. It's been proven technology. It's moving through approval processes. So that's great. And then for natural gas and oil operations, which is another huge chunk of methane emissions globally, EDF is launching a satellite sometime within the next year that will be able to detect and quantify methane emissions from oil and gas infrastructure around the globe with unprecedented precision. And a lot of times the hardest part of reducing methane from oil and gas is just knowing where the leaks are coming from. It isn't necessarily what's needed to fix those leaks. So I'm really excited about that as well.
Thank you. Jessica, Kevin Leahy asked, did you determine that direct air capture to deal with harder to abate sectors was not a plausible part of technology set to achieve net zero?
Actually, direct air capture would be included in that short list that I went through in I think I said the post-combustion cleanup of carbon-containing fuels and post-combustion carbon dioxide cleanup. Now, so yeah, I was using that as a general description, which would include direct air capture. I think it should be an element of the portfolio of technologies that we're investing in. And it's, I think whenever we're talking about the technologies that we're investing in, it's really important to think carefully about the portfolio and the upside and downside risks of different elements, and to balance that portfolio, really try to find the right level of concentration and diversification. Oftentimes in policy contexts, this phrase comes up, invest in all of the above, but in reality, we're always limited in terms of our financial resources. So we do have to concentrate a bit. But yeah, I would include that as an element of the portfolio, recognizing that it's still uncertain what role it would potentially play in the future. Thank
you. Leonard Miller asked a question that I actually think is going to be the topic of the next session, which is how do we deal with social intolerances to sacrifices to climate change solutions in the US, especially if US citizens don't witness that other major countries are not doing their part. So I do think that that's going to be a main topic of the next session. So unless if anybody wants to respond to that, however, here we still have about a minute left.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say something. I mean, I don't want to be sort of the one saying that technology innovation is going to fix everything. Technologies always have downside, negative impacts associated with them. So it's really about transitioning to more beneficial technologies. But I will say that, I don't know that the story that this is going to be a painful transition. I don't think it has to be. And I think we need to be better at really anticipating the impacts of technology, but also communicating, what's happened in the past and sort of how some of these technologies developed and what people can expect in the future in a scenario where we address climate change. What will they personally experience? I don't think it has to be a story of, a painful transition. It will actually bring a lot of other benefits that people will perceive and enjoy. And that is, I think, a big, an important part of moving this conversation forward and building public support for climate change mitigation.
Thank you very much. So we've come to the end of our allotted time. It's 10:55. The next panel starts at 11. So there's a programmed break now. So first of all, I want to thank especially the four panelists for terrific jobs, both in their formal presentations and responding to questions, and everybody who asked questions from the audience. And with that, Atif, I'm going to turn things back over to you so you can give us our instructions. I think we have a 5-minute break. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you, everyone. So we will start our next panel sharply at 11, and my colleague Elka Weber will be moderating that panel. So see everyone at 11 sharp. Thank you.